Okay, so you've got to the point in your HL 20490 studies where you've understood or at least been exposed to the different ways in which researchers build up and design their research projects. And now you need to start thinking about how, after you've collected all of your data in an ethically sound way, and you've considered how you want your research to be judged, you need to think about how you're going to write up the findings that you get. And this is what is called representation, or the presentation of your data. In this online lecture, we're going to go through a few of the different styles that exist for writing up research and how they are commonly attributed to different paradigmatic stances. So as we did with judgment criteria last week, once you know your paradigmatic stance, you know vaguely which type of write-up strategy is going to be appropriate for your dissertation, and then you can start to experiment, look into what other academics have done, and pick a strategy that is relevant for you. So qualitative researchers have several choices regarding the ways of representation. The most common way of representing research has been so-called realist writing, an objective third-person account of research findings. This style of representation has been considered the standard way to write up your research findings, particularly from a quantitative perspective, but there are other choices available to you within qualitative approaches to writing up. I've talked to you about the cultural turn before and the crisis of representation, and the new styles that have emerged in terms of writing and representation have come about since the crisis of representation, and they embody this notion that we shouldn't be writing things up objectively, but rather we should be trying to capture both our own experiences, our own reflexivity, and the experiences of research participants in a more creative way that potentially makes it easier for the reader of our outputs, for the reader of our dissertation, to understand the journey that has been undergone throughout the entire research process. So in this lecture, I'm initially going to expose you to what realist writing involves, but then I'm going to move on to trace the development of alternative research writing styles that have come about since what we call the narrative turn. I'll then go on to explain the meaning of the narrative turn in more detail before introducing some examples of different ways of writing qualitative research that are more creative and more subjective. So these creative approaches are called essayistic personal experience, literary personal experience narratives, and essayistic research stories, and finally literary research stories. So they kind of fall into two camps. One that involves writing about the experiences of the researcher, and the other camp where writing up involves writing up experiences of research participants. And in both cases, these are subdivided into the extent to which the research participants' voices are meddled with, for want of a better word. So the extent to which they are mediated and turned into creative prose rather than more factual prose. Quite often, if you start to read the leading journals within sports studies, you'll come across journal articles that have been written up in a very neutral manner, and they use the third person, as in the researcher says this, the researcher did that, to write up their findings. Sparks argues that this is what we call realist writing. So in texts of this kind, the researcher's voice is largely absent, and this type of research characterises particularly quantitative research, where the researcher is understood as an objective producer of knowledge, whose influence on the research results is eliminated as carefully as possible. So realist writing assumes that the author is invisible, yet an authoritative figure who provides a truthful account of reality. Sparks calls this the style of no style, in that technically if you read a journal article written in the realist tradition, you won't be able to differentiate between one author and another author, because the standardization of the way in which things are written up is so inherent that there is nothing to differentiate between authors when you're reading them. So Silk says that the stripped down, abstracted, detached form of language, the impersonal voice, and the statement of conclusions as propositions of formulae, involves a realist or externalizing technique that objectifies through depersonalization. This technique allows the text to give the impression that its symbols are inert, neutral representations that exist quite independently of the interests and efforts of the researcher who is presented as a neutral and disengaged analyst. So we can see that this is somewhat at odds with a qualitative researcher's subjective understanding of themselves. But going back to the lecture on reflexivity, where I was encouraging you to think about how you influence the research process and how your beliefs might shape what you choose to study and how you choose to study that subject matter, this kind of writing goes against that. It sort of jars and butts heads with it, but quite often qualitative researchers who are studying things that they have had a profound influence over still write up their findings in a realist way. And whilst there's nothing wrong with that, technically, it's something that's still widely accepted. Another camp of researchers have really tried to push forward the notion that we should move away from such detached and objective writing traditions. So, for example, Kryjek says that many of us do ethnography, but we write up in a conservative voice of science. In short, we often render our research reports devoid of human emotion and self-reflection. Or he says, as researchers, we experience life, but we write science. Despite the fact that many qualitative researchers have built their studies on inherently subjective epistemologies, they then don't go on to mention these kind of elements in their final text, and therefore the researcher remains absent objective in a manner that is very reminiscent of the quantitative tradition rather than the new qualitative tradition. It might be that the type of study that you're conducting means it's more appropriate to write it up in a realist tradition. But quite often, if you're trying to talk about things like pain or injury, embodied experiences, strongly emotional experiences, then academics have argued that it's a shame that we haven't tried harder to create and to write up our findings in ways that more overtly try and capture these experiences and portray them to the people who are going to read the outputs. So in other words, this type of writing tends to provide a flat, unidimensional account of complex experiences of the world. And because qualitative research attempts to provide deep analytical understanding of how people understand physical culture, it appears that realist writing does not really help us to convey the complexity we are aiming to portray. So in the Marcular and Silk book, there's a really nice summary of what the narrative turn actually encapsulates. And they argue that it was in the 1980s that qualitative social science research began to focus more intensely on the role of writing in the research process. So the role of the author as an authoritative, objective presenter of facts had already been challenged by several post-structuralist philosophers such as Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault and François Lyotard. And if you think back to the judgment criteria that was put forward by post-structuralist philosophers in last week's lecture, we can see that represented in that what they judged good quality research to be, and what they wanted their research to be considered alongside, was how the writing itself, creative practices in terms of writing and linguistic style, tried to step outside of traditional ways of writing up, but also tried to challenge the power relationships that exist within the research setting. So in other words, how can we write creatively to empower research participants, and how can we write creatively to kind of sideline realist approaches to writing? In their seminal text, these scholars began to question writing as a transparent and taken for granted way of representing data that was necessarily considered as some sort of raw material for researchers' analysis. This kind of unproblematized understanding of the role of research writing was argued to assume an immediacy of experience. So providing an account of other people's experiences is only a matter of recording their words in the final research output. With this kind of objective account of what the real world is really about, the researcher remained an invisible but authoritative provider of what they called truth. So it was highlighted around about the turn of the narrative turn that as qualitative research fundamentally challenged this kind of attitude towards research, this kind of positivist logic, it was really strange that realist research writing hadn't been affected up until that point, and we hadn't tried to move beyond realist approaches to writing up studies. So this led to the narrative turn, and as a result, a number of academics started experimenting with new ways of writing that are probably quite familiar to you by now. They're not still the majority, or in any way possibly not even half of the research outputs that are out there, but they are commonly seen in every journal article now, particularly within the social sciences. So these kind of representations of research data included the multiple voices of those being represented, including the researcher's voice. So it wasn't any good just to move beyond only representing what the researcher thought fact was as a result of studying a particular context, and it was. So out of the narrative turn comes this notion that we need to write up in a more creative fashion, whether it involves the use of video or audio, dance performance is one thing, but actually referring to the textual output, as in the dissertation that you produce, there are also ways of enriching the writing process so that it is better able to capture the experiences of people and events and the power relationships that operate within certain settings. And there are a number of ways of doing this, but these tend to fall under what has been termed creative analytic processes. Creative analytic processes are all about personal experience, either the personal experience of research participants or the personal experience of the researcher, him or herself. These approaches to writing take skill and they take time to master, and they're quite varied in their nature. And they're kind of on a spectrum somewhere between fact and fiction, in that the researcher, whilst attempting to write more creatively, manipulates language to an extent or not, depending on which approach is chosen, to convey experience or to convey situations to the reader. So it's not necessarily about representing fact, it's about capturing an essence of a situation so that the reader is able to sympathise or empathise with that context, to feel it themselves as they are reading, and therefore gain, supposedly, a closer understanding of what is going on in the research setting. Markula and Silk argue that this kind of writing goes beyond cold-hearted description to create a more fleshed out, visceral portrait of the real, in inverted commas. So it's a style of writing that aims to move the reader to think and act critically and reflexively. And this is reiterated by Markula and Dennison in 2005. Unlike the objective writing style of realism, the need for creativity involves a sense of style. So creative analytic processes are highly personal to the researcher who's written them up. Because obviously to write creatively you need some kind of practice, you need some kind of tradition of your own, develop some kind of skill in the domain of creative writing itself. So you can begin to see styles of writing just as you do in fictional works. This isn't considered a negative thing, but rather something that should be celebrated. If we can't get outside the conundrum of writing research up objectively, because we always have an influence on that research, then we might as well celebrate that fact and actually embrace it and show our own identity as researchers even further through the creative practice of writing. Commonly, you won't find an entire dissertation written up in a creative approach, but it's more likely to be sections within the analysis section of the dissertation. So the earlier stages will be written up in a way that is still paradigmatically consistent with the type of writing style chosen in the latter sections. So if you are trying to embrace subjectivity, then you would write up your dissertation methodology, literature review and introduction in the first person, I, but then you might embrace some of the creative analytic processes I'm going to cover in a minute. So the goal of creative analytic practices more broadly, as we've seen through the slides so far, is to capture polyvocality, in essence make sure that everybody who's involved in the research context voice is somehow being exposed to the reader of the final dissertation, whether it be the researcher or the research participants, or both preferably. And also this sense of visceral contextualization, that there's an essence of embodied spirit, embodied connection between the reader of the dissertation and the researcher who's written up their feelings or their research participants' feelings about a specific situation. So Richardson argues that this kind of text kind of rely on the imagination of the reader of the dissertation to understand what is going on within a social context. To kind of make the process of choosing a creative analytic approach more simple, Markula and Silk have divided the techniques that have been devised by previous scholars into personal experience narratives and research stories. And personal experience narratives refer to research outputs that are capturing the researcher's personal experiences, so they might be through autoethnographic approaches. And research stories tend to rely on research data that is coming from other participants, so through interviews, through workshops, through focus groups, shadowing people in different contexts. We can begin to understand their lived experiences of different contexts, and then we can write them up more creatively through research stories. And then within these two categories, we've subdivided them into literary approaches and essayistic approaches. And these refer to the extent to which fictional writing standards are drawn upon to make the reader further identify with what is going on in that social context. So it's almost like a spectrum with some kind of claim to accuracy on one side and some kind of claim to fiction on the other side. So essayistic personal experience, like I just said, it involves the researcher, him or herself, building up a set of data, empirical data, normally through writing journal entries on a context or a topic of their choice, normally that they have some kind of prior involvement in, but not necessarily. It could be something that you're exposing yourself to for the first time. You can't just arbitrarily reflect on an experience that happened to you in the past if you have no kind of data to draw from. So the idea is that you still need to have some kind of data collection process going on through the construction of journal entries. You might be able to get away with this if you happen to be someone who does do a lot of documentation of your kind of potentially holiday accounts, your gap year experiences. If you are someone who writes a diary, you can potentially sidestep this issue, but you can't just arbitrarily use memories as a research source. Once you build up your journal entries and your reflections on your involvement in a particular sporting context, then you can use these just as you would research participant quotes in more traditional writing styles, alongside theoretical debates and other academic literature, to build up a picture of how your personal experiences are the result of socially constructed norms and power relationships. Other ways of doing this, for example, are through the use of vignettes. So you might contextualize your experience using academic literature, and then you might provide a longer, more in-depth extract or rephrasing of your journal entries. Either way, there's no sort of right or wrong way of writing this up. The central premise within essayistic personal experience is that you are drawing on your own experience or involvement in a sporting situation, in the case of the BA in Sport and Social Science, that you can then theorise to argue how your experience is potentially illustrative of grander issues that operate within society. Markula and Silk argue that some authors use literary devices such as shifts in time. They can bring in imagery, so you can, if you are writing journal entries, you can also take photographic evidence of particular situations and reflect on those within your write-up. And through the writing style that you use, you can start to build tension or other emotional responses for the reader of that dissertation. Again, Markula and Silk argue that because of the minimal requirement of training in creative writing, essayistic personal experience narrative is often a good way for a beginning writer, someone who's not used to writing about their own experiences and writing creatively, to start to experiment with alternative ways of research representation. So the previous approach can be embellished, for want of a better word, into a different approach called literary personal experience narratives. And the narrative element is what is differentiating here between the previous experience and the previous way of writing up and this way of writing up, in that we move further towards the realm of fiction and we mess around with the raw data to a greater extent in order to gain more evocative writing responses from the output, so that someone reading a dissertation is more likely to feel and experience what actually took place in the context in which the study was being conducted. So while literary personal experience narratives are similar to essayistic personal narratives, in that they're based on events that really happen to the author, they call upon fiction writing techniques such as dramatic recall, strong imagery, fleshed out characters, unusual phrasings, puns, subtexts, allusions, flashbacks, flash forwards, tone shifts, synecdoche, dialogue, and interior monologue in order to make this writing more evocative for the reader. Commonly, this kind of research is still based on journal entries as the main kind of form of data collection approach, but the way in which this original data is used is manipulated to a much greater extent through these literary devices. So it said that using literary aesthetics allows the author or the researcher to add sensuality, smell, sound, mood, and intensity of feelings to provide nuanced and energetic writing that is full of vitality. So this isn't about providing a true picture, this is about providing an evocative picture of a research context. We're not trying to tell a story, we're trying to show a story to the reader of the dissertation. But ultimately, we're still trying to do this to demonstrate the social construction of identity, the self, and experiences, and how certain power contexts are influencing how people experience sporting situations. Obviously, if something is written in such an evocative fashion, the extent to which the reader identifies with it is going to vary depending on the reader's personal experience themselves. So there's an understanding that no two people are going to read a study and get the same things from it. So it further muddies the water between how we kind of capture an essence of reality, in that not only can we not capture it in the first place and represent it objectively, but there's no guarantee that the two people reading the findings are going to understand it in the same way either. Ultimately, though, the people who are writing within this kind of tradition aren't seeking that kind of validation. Their research won't be judged in terms of last week's judgment criteria, in terms of how replicable a study is, so more in line with the foundationalist approaches, but it will be judged in terms of how it can evoke emotion and sense, and how it is creatively using language to provide some kind of impact on the person reading that study. So it's more in line with post-structuralist approaches to judgment criteria. Obviously, we can think of certain contexts that this kind of writing style is going to be more appropriate to than others. So, for example, if we're talking about pain and injury, physical loss, sensitive subjects like sexuality, abuse, or harassment, then whilst difficult to write up because of the emotional element involved, these kind of subjects are going to be more ripe for exploration in comparison to studies that potentially are trying to invoke some kind of policy change, or that are more about providing a contextual mapping of a situation. For example, in terms of how many people visit an area and what is the impact of those visitors on the environmental quality of that area. There's not the same need to write up evocatively in those kind of studies as there are potentially in studies of abuse or crime or embodied experiences of pain within different sporting settings. So essayistic research stories and literary research narratives reflect the same changes in approach that are evident within personal narratives and personal research stories. The only difference being that at this point we're using research participants' stories and experiences rather than the researcher's own. So these experiences can be gathered through interviews, through ethnography, focus groups, any other kind of participatory action research that involves other people in your study beyond you as a researcher. So essayistic research stories aim to add evocativeness, usually by organising the participants' words into a coherent story, rather than providing them in brief quotations, as has been kind of the norm within realist approaches to writing and representation. So by doing this, the stories can illustrate commonalities, shared experiences, or impact of a specific context more effectively than realist accounts might allow for. Markula and Silcott have drawn upon Bruce's study that represented the voices of 22 women sports writers that were interviewed through the use of a single monologue. So 22 different research participants' voices were combined into one monologue to illustrate some of the key experiences that these women were experiencing as they were interviewing male athletes. The result is not to argue that this was one experience, to conflate all of those experiences into one representation. The result is to build a picture that is more interesting to read for the reader, rather than saying, this person said this person said this person said this. It's a more evocative way of getting at the same point. However, the key point is that with essayistic approaches, there is quite minimal manipulation other than decontextualizing quotes. In other words, taking quotes from one person and adding them to the quotes of another person. Other than that kind of time shift operation, there's very little influence of the researcher on what was actually said. So it literally is a question of merging a series of quotes into one story without any kind of change in the language that was used by the research participants themselves. So it's more a question of reordering rather than fabricating or changing. This kind of research is also heavily theoretically contextualised, so it does look still relatively traditional when compared to the next approach we're going to look at. So the most constructive structure for essayistic research stories resembles the structure of a conventional research article, with a literature review and theoretical framework to set up the essayistic research stories, and then an analysis and discussion section that follows this. So this is something that actually, even within realist approaches, is starting to be moved beyond, in that quite often the theory and the results are presented together. So you have your findings, your theory, and your personal reflection on all of these meshed into one. But in this case, normally within essayistic research stories, the stories are presented as a separate section as the data. So in other words, the results, and this comes before a discussion section where you reflect on these. So even though the section that contains the quotes reformulated into a story is lacking in theoretical contextualization, this is still there before and after in different sections of the dissertation. So the final of the four creative analytic processes that we're going to look at is literary research stories. And as I'm sure you start to gather, these again are reflecting the personal experiences of the researcher that we looked at a minute ago. So literary research stories, they're again based on data that is gathered from research participants, but they're moving towards a further kind of fictional element through the use of different writing styles and creative practices. So in this sense, the text provided by research participants, in other words, your transcripts, that you gathered for your dissertation will be manipulated to a much larger degree than the previous approach, to the extent that they can look like fictional writing. So Markula and Dennison argue that literary research stories resemble more than any other form of writing the qualities of fiction. So similar to literary personal experience narratives, they show rather than tell how particular experiences are constructed within a certain context. They're not about representing truth and accuracy, they are about evoking experience. Literary research stories aren't necessarily about a distinct conclusion, so they don't close down, they don't have any sort of final concluding point to them. They're more open, and they're just about exposing the reader to some sense of the experience that the research participants have gone through. So they're an attempt to provide a greater evocative depiction of others' lives through the heightened dramatisation of real events, using literary devices as alternative points of view, strong characterisation, unusual phrasings, and subtext. Again, this kind of research isn't really appropriate for every kind of study. It's quite often used to expose experiences of people who are operating within sort of taboo contexts. So potentially, if we're trying to empower research participants, we might try to gain a sense of empathy from readers. So if we can provide a greater understanding of what it feels like for someone to go through something, then public understanding and stigmatization towards whatever that thing might be might diminish. So it is quite an empowering way of researching and seeking to validate the experiences of people who are quite often marginalized within society. So sub-identities, for example, are quite often exposed through this kind of research. Things like ethnicity, gender politics, experiences of racial inequality are all things that are commonly written up in this kind of way, often from feminist perspectives or post-colonial perspectives as well. Okay, so I've spent most of this lecture talking about creative approaches to writing up your research findings. But there are some issues with this, and I'm not saying that everybody should go out and do a creative approach to representation. We have to think about, firstly, writing skills and whether or not you have them. It's not an easy thing to write creatively if it's not something that you're used to, if you don't have that background. And it is potentially dangerous to try and learn that skill on a dissertation project that is worth quite a lot of your degree credit. So it might be the case that actually realism provides a sense of security and familiarity. You're used to reading journal articles that are written in a realist tradition. Replicating those is probably going to be more simple and familiar to you than embarking on a more creative approach. The second issue is to think about whether your research topic is relevant to be written up in a more creative approach. As I've said in each of the slides, unless you really are trying to evoke some kind of embodied, emotional or aesthetic experience, then it might not be appropriate to embark on a creative approach to writing or representation. Potentially, your supervisor might not think that writing creatively is appropriate for your study either, or they might not be someone who is keen on you going down that avenue. I think it's probably quite unlikely, and you would be supported if your choice in a creative method of writing up was relevant to your study. But it is also something to consider at this point. And finally, you've got to think about the impact of your research. Who's going to be reading your dissertation, and are they going to get why you've written it up in the way that you have? If the people reading your dissertation, so for example, if you want to feed back your research findings to the audiences or the people that you brought into your research earlier, so for example, if you're doing an evaluation study and you wanted to then feed back some sense of good practice to the organisation you were working with, it might not make sense to provide lengthy quotations or stories about personal experience, but rather bullet points and succinct writing up in a more realist tradition will have more impact, and your research will be judged more favourably within that context. Equally, you have to think about things like if you're trying to kind of inform some development of policy, some kind of change on a bigger scale, still there is a sense that more objective writing styles are valued amongst non-academic audiences. So you have to think about where your research is going and how best to meet the needs of the people who are reading it. There's still quite a lot of animosity between academics and wider audiences because this kind of creative approach isn't necessarily appreciated by wider audiences. But if you want your research to have an impact, then you have to consider that from the start and do what is best for the longevity of the project. So just some final thoughts before concluding this online lecture. As I just said, there is still a place for realist writing, and it might be more appropriate that including reflexivity into your methodology within a more traditional write-up style that is emblematic of realist writing is a more appropriate route to go down if you're not comfortable with either embarking on creative writing approaches, or if your context of study is not particularly appropriate to more creative approaches. Whatever the case, you need to consider what your paradigmatic assumption is before deciding on which approach you're going to take to writing. So obviously, if you're going down a positivist or a post-positivist approach, then a realist writing is the only real way to go. The latter forms of paradigmatic traditions, such as interpretivism, critical theory, give you more flexibility to go in either direction, particularly interpretivist writing. If you start moving into more postmodern, post-structural approaches to paradigmatic stance, then you might need to actually think about more creative ways of writing, because the whole point is that your research is being judged in terms of how you're trying to use language to expose how power relationships are formed, and therefore writing in a very traditionalist way will only reinforce the kind of circular issues that are evident within your project. So if you're trying to get outside of language, you can't then write up in a very standardised way. Despite that, we know that we can't step outside of power relationships entirely, even if we are trying to empower our research participants or marginalised groups within society. And it doesn't matter how creative we try and be in the process, ultimately we are still the ones that decide what we're going to study, when we're going to study it, and who we're going to include in our study, and there's no real way of escaping that conundrum. So even if we're going to try and represent those people's opinions as best we can in more creative approaches that give the reader a greater sense of what people's experiences are, we still have to be aware that we have influenced the project quite significantly. Finally, there's no clear-cut boundary between the kind of creative approaches that we've looked at here that are predicated on first-person narrative. So in other words, not bringing in research participants' findings, and writing styles that are evident in autoethnography, for example. So if you are going to embark on an autoethnography for your dissertation, there is no reason that you can't use the two personal writing styles that we've discussed today, or you might want to write up in a more traditional autoethnographic approach. And the only way you can get used to the subtleties of difference that are evident between these is by reading lots of autoethnographic writing yourself. And if you look back over the slides from semester 1, we looked at the differences between analytic and evocative autoethnographic approaches. So it might be more appropriate for you to title your writing style either evocative or analytic autoethnography rather than the two techniques we've looked at today. Again, this is a matter of personal choice. Potentially you might find it easier to research how to write up autoethnography rather than representational styles. So it's up to you which path you go down. Okay, so that's it for writing and representation styles. I've provided some material on Moodle for you to explore examples of these different writing styles. I think the easiest way to see them, to see what's being talked about, is to read some journal articles that are in the styles of these different approaches, and then you can begin to compare and contrast what they look like. You will remember on Friday I asked you to vote if you wanted to continue with online lectures or to go back to normal lectures. So obviously for online lectures to continue, I had to know by Sunday for it to be released on Monday, and at the last count we were something like 11:10, which out of 96 students is not very conclusive. So I've stuck with online lectures for this week. If you could all vote by next week, then obviously that will provide a fairer representation, thinking about quality and validity of research numbers in terms of quantitative data. I'm sure you'll be aware that a difference of 1 at this stage doesn't mean much out of 96 participants, so get voting. Because we've continued this week at least with online lectures, we'll have another group workshop on Friday. Again, you can ask me anything that has been troubling you up until this point, and we'll have some more activities to do in the lecture. Before you come, not the lecture, sorry, the group workshop, before you come, make sure you do the required tasks that I've written up on Moodle for you. Obviously, that will depend, your ability to get that done before the workshop will depend on how much you get out of the workshop itself. So see Moodle for what you've got to do there, and I'll see you on Friday.